Welcome again to another episode of Real Wealth Podcast. This is Mike Proctor, your host, and we're sponsored by Leading Edge Financial Planning. Today, we have the esteemed guest, Shaunti Feldhahn. Her and her husband, Jeff, are both Harvard grads, and her husband's an attorney. They both have done a ton of research in just behavioral finance, how people work, tick. You partnered up with Thrivent Financial for your most recent book, and it's been a huge hit. Actually, I haven't asked you how many books you sold, but I don't know if I can ask that. But I'm sure it's a lot. I loved it. I've read it 2.5 times now, and my wife and I are discussing through it. I can read it more. I'll keep reading it. I'm sorry you can't see your facial expression if you're listening, but so they have been married 22 years. And they've done 13 years of quote unquote relationship research. They have recently written Thriving in Love and Money. And it's about communication around money. It's so interesting how money is just a lightning rod for everything within us, depth wise, conflict wise, unresolved stuff. And Shaunti has a very interesting calling of I'd say professionally spanning therapy and the world of finance. A couple, so myself and both Lyndon here in our office, we haven't sat for the test for whatever reason. Neither one of us, we keep egging each other on to schedule it, but we're like intimidated because the case study. That's not relevant here, but it's really great material. But Shaunti is an educator with Kingdom Advisors, and she's in the curriculum. And so we've both really appreciated hearing what you have to say about money, the behavioral side. So I'll stop trying to introduce, and we can get going. So Shaunti, welcome on, and it was so great to meet you at the No Hope World Conference.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, that was an absolutely spectacular conference. 5, 6, 7,000, whatever it was, people, helpers, counselors, therapists, all in one place. It was amazing.
Absolutely, and it was so neat. It was so okay, and so we don't need to talk about the conference. Let's talk about this. I want to talk about your book because it's so applicable to what we do. So I'm a financial planner, and how do you identify yourself professionally? Are you more of a writer or a therapist or financial advisor? And you're working on your PhD.
The way that I introduce myself is usually just as a social researcher.
Okay.
What I sort of feel called to do is essentially, for years now, we have been digging out the little things that really will make a big difference in your life, in your relationships, in your finances, in whatever area of life it is. And so we do these pretty extensive research studies. They're always nationally representative, and try to dig out something that is something we tend not to get, but that will really make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what you found is that you and your husband are actually the perfect examples of people who should be writing a book about how good you are at money, right?
No. We actually got pushed into this. It was so hilarious. Do you mind if I just tell you how this started?
Please.
This was definitely not a project that I would have thought of doing, even though a lot of our research over the years has been on relationship-based things. Because, if you want to try to help people thrive in their lives, relationships are usually a big piece of that, right? And this area wasn't anything I had thought to study, which, if you think about it, is kind of crazy. Because when you talk about marriage, for example, money is a big issue in marriage. But we had actually been kind of pondering how we were going to make the research process work going forward, because the business models had changed. It's kind of complicated, but basically we were wondering, are we going to be able to continue to do research? Because the business model basically made it impossible to afford out of pocket. We used to just self-finance everything.
Right.
And we get a call out of the blue from Thrivent Financial, and they basically were saying, we're starting a new initiative because we know money is one of the big issues in marriage. We don't think it has to be. So how would you feel about making this your next research project and us funding it? And instantly, of course, Jeff and I were like, oh my gosh, that's incredible. And then about 30 seconds later, we thought, oh my gosh, oh dear. Because this means we're going to have to actually talk about money, because money was, after all these years of research, money was one of the main issues that we just did not talk about. It was one of our big issues in marriage. And so, yeah, we were not at all the type of people that you would think would start this project, but it ended up being perfect, because the whole project was not how do you have a great budget, but how do you have a great relationship around money.
Right. And so the next question on my mind is in what 70% of divorces are driven by financial issues is what I've been told and heard.
I'm actually not sure that that's accurate, just based on, there's been so much written about this, and some of it is accurate and some of it isn't.
Okay.
Sonia Britt
Mm-hmm.
at Kansas
K-State.
State, I think. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
She actually did a pretty extensive study that found, in general, that money was maybe not the primary cause of divorce, but certainly one of the main causes of divorce. But I wouldn't say it was quite 70%.
Right. So actually Dayton, who works in our office, he studied with Sonia.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, and I think she's, I don't know that she's at K-State anymore, and but anyways, so I'm a K-Stater too. Yeah,
Ah, I
she's right in
gotcha.
our own backyard.
That's
Um,
incredible. I'm
but
jealous. She's incredible.
yeah, and but yeah, so it's not so much that money's the issue. I think can you speak to how money is actually how we work out a lot of stuff, and how it brings out behavior and brings out underlying things that we're struggling to talk about as a married couple? And I'm not talking about us, because of course not,
Of
but
course not.
actually it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. Well, and you are not alone. We're not alone. What we actually found statistically is that 77% of couples can't talk about money well. Only 23% can.
Hmm.
And by the way, guess who tends to go to the financial advisors? And guess who tends to go to like the Dave Ramsey class? It
The people
tends
who
to be the
can.
people who can already talk about money relatively well.
Mm.
Um, that was a very interesting finding. The reality is that for most couples, you have two different people who are trying to do money together. And what we found in the research, that was kind of the summary of the whole thing. Like, you could stop the podcast with this one kind of finding that's running under the surface, is that it turns out when you are getting sideways around money, when there's tension around money, you want to handle things differently. It turns out it's actually not about the money at all.
Hmm.
It turns out it's entirely about how money makes us feel,
Mm.
and how it makes our spouse feel. And it's about this host of expectations about how money should work, or certain belief systems, or fears, or worries, or various insecurities, all of this stuff that's kind of running under the surface. And that is actually what is going on when we tend to have tension or frustrations, or just look at things differently. It has nothing to do with the money. It has all to do with all this other stuff running under the surface.
Okay, so I just have one question. How do we thrive in love and money?
Well, the most important starting point for, really, for anybody, and it this is going to be the case no matter how you handle things and no matter what you think, is if you are married, you're going to have to understand not just where you are on, if it's not about the money, what is it about? You have to understand your spouse. And you have to actually understand what are those things that are running under the surface. Because basically, we found that we tend to do money in the wrong order. We tend to start, and this is no offense to you as a financial advisor. This is a common thing amongst financial advisors, where we tend to start with, okay, how do we do the technical things? How do we build margin, for example? How do we get a sense of what sort of products that you're going to need to take you into the future? All of how do we create a great budget if you need to back up and do that, or get out of debt? Whatever those things are, that's where we tend to start. And the
Mm-hmm.
reality is, you can't do that until you can talk about money with your spouse. And you can't talk about money with your spouse until you can understand that stuff that's running under the surface. And so you have to accomplish that first. And then now you have something you can talk about, and now you can create the margin. Now you can do the good financial planning. Now you can, do whatever elementary things that have to be done, or the advanced things that have to be done in your financial life together. The problem comes so often is, the reason we're on two different pages is because it's not about that technical stuff, but all the other stuff.
Mm. Right. Right. So there's a couple directions I might want to go with that. One is, my good friend David Case came down and met with us because we keep trying to talk about money. And I'm like, no, we got to read this book. Like, this book is so like, okay, we got like into chapter 2 or 3 to get, this is when we started reading. I'd read it 2 times by the time like we sat down and started going through it together.
Oh, that's
And you
funny.
listed off those 22 different items. I
Yeah.
think you're on like 16 or 17. She's like, which one don't we have? Of what was the label? It was like damaging mindsets to have in your relationship or
Exactly.
something.
Exactly. No, what we did, what you're referring to, is that we actually quantified, because this was based on a nationally representative study. We probably should mention that. Several thousand people, and we quantified, what is it that tends, when you say that we tend to have issues around money, what specifically do we mean about that?
Mm-hmm.
Because all of the things that tend to come up, they are different amongst different couples, and some of them are pretty significant compared to others. And so, yeah, these are all kind of the damaging mindsets. They're the things that end up causing the issues. They're the things that end up being where we and our spouse sleep in separate bedrooms because we're so mad or whatever. And so,
I
yeah,
know what you're talking
there.
about.
I feel your pain when you say, which ones don't we have? Because that is actually the most common scenario, is
Mm,
that most of us have multiples of
yeah,
those.
yeah. And then how do we deal with it? And but it was so good. So David came down and he's like, Mike, you process things mostly um, intellectually, and you're good with that. No, okay, no, hey, I see the look. Okay, I understand. I'm still. It's all emotional still, but like I can get stuck in my head, and that's how I make my decision. And I'm like a small percentage emotional and spiritually processing it, and then she's processing it mostly. He's like, she's still stuck over here. She's not there yet. You got to slow down. And so I started talking real slow, and I got in trouble. But anyways, it
I
was it
can see
was
how that would get you in trouble. Yes.
well. Anyways, so it was so good, but at the end of it, it was like, hey, you both just got to like be willing to lay down the decisions you've already made, and say, you know what, you are more important than this decision. And then we
Yeah.
went out, we had a nice dinner, and we slept in the same room, which is great, and all the things. But man, money is so hard to talk about,
Yeah.
even when you're married to a marriage and family therapist. Like, it's still really hard. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I wanted to get that out there, that we're working through the book, and it's hard work. We're
Well,
we're gonna get
if
there.
if I could just take a guess based on what you've said, you sound, if I'm hearing this correctly, like a pattern that is very, very common. Certainly the majority of couples. I think, I'm trying to remember what the number was. I think it was around 2/3 of couples, somewhere in that ballpark,
Mm.
where you have one person who is not necessarily, they would not necessarily consider themselves a money person, right? Like they're not crazy. It's just that they don't listen to financial podcasts for fun, or, they don't read money books as something that's like on their nightstand to read the next thing that's, come out or whatever.
Right.
And it's usually that you have that person who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves a money person married to someone who does consider themselves a money person. That is a very, very common dynamic. And it creates its own set of issues. And I'm guessing because of this podcast, probably many people who are listening to this right now are finding themselves in that situation. The top question that when you talk about money, call-in radio programs, right? The top question that the host always gets is, how can I get my spouse on the same page? How can we get on the same page
Mm.
around money? And what I always have to kind of carefully say, and I'll tell you this, and I'll tell anyone who's listening to this,
No,
is
pick on me. Pick on me.
okay. Well, I'm not going to pick on you because I think everybody's probably in that sort of space if they're, listening to a money related podcast. Is, I will tell you that you have to recognize, and this is a very important mental shift when you are saying, how can I get my spouse on the same page? Like, how can we get on the same page around money? You may not realize it, but it is highly likely that what you're thinking is, how do I get my spouse to agree with me?
Mm.
How do I get my spouse to see that I'm right?
Well, of
How do I
course.
get my spouse to see that this is the way that you should do things? And listen, I'm not disputing. There may be actually some things that you're saying that are 100% objectively right. But one of the things that we have to dive into if we want a great marriage around money is, and this is one of the factors that we found 5 things in the research that tend to come up over and over again around money and marriage. And one of them is that we don't realize that we are not valuing what our spouse is valuing.
Mm-hmm.
And that we have to kind of go, oof, you know what? It isn't just about me. Maybe there is something that my spouse brings to the table here that I'm just not hearing.
Absolutely. It's it's interesting though, because when we get married, we become one. And theoretically, internally, we're already one.
Yeah.
But the world of therapy would tell us we're actually not all that integrated. We got all these broken parts inside until we work on them real hard. And then you bring another person into that and they got broken parts, you got broken parts, or try to fit broken parts together. It should be easy.
No.
Right? No? Okay.
Yeah. No, this is one of the things that I always want to encourage. If there are people who are money people married to someone who's not necessarily a money person in that same way, is to recognize you actually have an incredible opportunity in front of you, because it is highly likely, and I'm not saying this like is always going to be the case, I'm just statistically, it's highly likely that part of how you handle things around money without intending to, you may have made in the past your spouse feel unloved,
Mm.
disrespected, uncared for, invalidated without ever intending to. Right? I am absolutely not saying that this was an intentional thing. It usually is very unintentional. And yet, so now, if that rings a bell, if you think that that is possible, then you have a great opportunity in front of you, because you know how you said, Mike, that we're supposed to be one, right? It's not just you and me anymore, it's we.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you have a great opportunity to demonstrate that and to actually show love and care and respect and appreciation in a way that maybe your spouse hasn't been used to. And it can be very, very impactful in the marriage because you are making your spouse feel deeply cared for.
Yeah, that's so good. And, it's almost like when they realize too how much you're actually laying down to meet them where they're at, they appreciate it that much more.
Yeah.
Hopefully they recognize it.
Yeah.
Um, and what was the other thought that I had? There was that piece. Oh, but even in your book, you talk about uh, assigning intention
Yeah.
to one another. If we
Yeah.
don't like, if Stephanie went out and bought, 52 gallons of cotton candy, I'd be like, why would you do that? You know, I'd still wouldn't know, but I can either say that was really, bad, or you meant to, cause harm or something. But yeah, that assigning tension, those just those little like weeds that pop up in the relationship they start small, and before you know it, you guys are yelling at each other about it. And sorry.
Well, the idea, and this is for everybody to be aware of. You're aware of this because you've already read the book, but this actually comes from, we've seen this over and over and over again in all the studies that we've done over the last 10, 15 years, which is that one of the dynamics that you can put in place, it's sort of a choice. It's not necessarily a natural feeling, but
Hmm.
everybody can do this. But one of the dynamics that really, really improves a marriage in any area, but certainly in money, is to believe the best of your spouse's intentions towards you.
Absolutely.
And even if they do something that you think is completely crazy, cotton candy, like you said, it is imperative that we sort of pull back on some of the natural things that tend to come to our mind. Like, they do not care that I'm going to have to work, 12 and a half hours to make up for this one purchase or
Mm.
whatever, whatever that is. What you're saying is, my spouse doesn't care about me.
Hmm.
And it's so critical for us to pull that back and go, no, no, I know that's not true. I know my spouse cares about me. I know they appreciate me. I know that they understand how hard I have to work. So there must be another explanation here. Either that, or it's just a difference of opinion. And why is my opinion right and theirs is wrong? Because that's crazy too, right? Like, that I'm always right. So that one starting point, we found statistically, was the case with the vast majority of couples. It was something like 99.26 something percent of
Mm.
people deeply care about their spouse, even, by the way, in really, really difficult relationships. But if you want a good relationship, you have to let yourself believe that and pull back those thoughts that would say otherwise.
Yeah, that's so good, man. How many times do we just not even give our spouse a chance? We're like, boom, you're sentenced.
Yep.
You messed up.
For sure. Yep.
Um, here's there's a couple things around this. So one of the questions here is, what advice do you have for someone who wants to work together on family's finances, but their spouse has no interest?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that we actually looked at that pretty specifically in the research. And I'll be blunt if you don't mind. There is usually a reason that the spouse has no interest.
Mm.
And the main reason, now, not the only one, okay? I need to say this right up front. None of
Okay.
these was like 100%, right? But the main reason, the majority of cases, I should say, is that one spouse has made clear to the other spouse that they kind of don't value what the spouse values, and so the second spouse has basically said, I have no interest in doing this with you. Like,
Mm.
you have your opinion of how things should be, and I can't break through that and have you look at my opinion, and so I'm kind of out, and we'll just cope around money, and we'll we'll kind of, you handle things with your paycheck over here and I'll handle things with my paycheck over here, but I really don't want to do money together. I don't want to talk about it. Now, that is not going to be everybody. Obviously, there's all sorts of reasons that we saw in the research, and we got into some of those in the book. But that's the biggie.
Mm.
And so that would be the one thing that I would sort of encourage people to go, okay, how do I do that?
Right. How do they solve, at least mend their side of the fence, take care of their stuff as far as how they are curious about their spouse
Yes.
and what their spouse cares about?
Well, can I explain the whole thing about how we sometimes don't value what our
Okay.
spouse is valuing? Because this is really at the root of that. And it's actually that this concept is one of the key findings in the whole study. And it's actually the main cause of the day-to-day stuff, the day-to-day arguments, the day-to-day tensions that tend to arise in this area. And so, okay, so here's basically, I've said this before, but let me just say it one more time, that the key is that we're often not valuing what our spouse is valuing. And what I mean by that is we we know, like, in our brain, that we are married to a different human. Like, we are aware that this person is different from us and they're going to care about something different than we do sometimes. And we know that, all of us. And yet, the thing that we have to grapple with is that when it comes to money, we have to make another jump, another step that is actually quite difficult, especially for money people. And that is to say, and because this other person is different than I am, that what they care about and what they value is just as legitimate as what I care about and what I value. And that can be an incredibly scary step to take. Like, that's a leap that
Sure.
is hard for a lot of people. And so let me give you an example so that you can see sort of a benign version of this, right? So suppose that you have one of you says that, one of the things we really need to be using our discretionary funds for is we really need to be saving up for a nice vacation every year. That, we work a lot of hours and it's really important to get away for a couple weeks. And so that's where a lot of those extra funds are going to go. Where the other person is thinking, we work a lot of hours, we work all the time. What's really important is for us to make sure that our extra funds are allocated for a date night every 2 weeks so that we can get away and we can connect and catch up. And it's really important to do that regularly, not just once a year on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are either of those two values, the things that these two different people are valuing, are either of those right or wrong? No, right? Like, they're just different.
Sure.
And if you had 100 objective observers looking at these two things that these two different people value, no one's going to be able to say, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's wrong, right? The issue is that so often we get these ideas in our head that this is just the right way to do it. And so I think it's just obvious that we need to have a date night every 2 weeks. Like, it's so clear. And the person on the other side is like, it's so clear that it's obvious that we have to save up for the vacation every year. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble in the
Right.
relationship, is because we think it's just so obvious that such and such needs to happen. And we don't realize that, wait a minute, actually what my spouse values is just as legitimate as what
Mm-hmm.
I value. Unless you would have 100 objective observers that would look at, a gambling addiction or something. You would have 100 objective observers that would say, oh yeah, there's a clear right and a clear wrong here. But the vast majority of cases, no, there's not. You're just valuing two different things. And so you have to be willing to say, oof, maybe I need to sort of step back and say, it seems so obvious to me, but maybe it's not.
Yeah. That's hard to do. And yeah, so that gets actually back down to the very practical advice David gave us, which was, hey, both of you, why don't you try laying down the decisions you've already made and
Yeah.
say, you know what, you're more important than this decision.
Yeah.
And that was such a good ending point, starting point. But yeah, so it really just speaks to that, because we both just felt this like release of like, that's good. We value each other.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I'm glad. I'm glad you guys took that step.
Um, okay. So, the other thing I was going to ask about is, now that this is switching gears. So we have the lifestyle portion, and then also the entrepreneurial side. So in your case, we're talking about a lot of book stuff, which is entrepreneurial, but I want to put a little bit of a twist on it, because I'm really curious when I have clients, or rather prospects, that come in and we're talking about. So you're talking about in this industry going for the solution, the the technical stuff, which I got really hung up in for a while, for several years, until I realized, okay, not only am I just confusing people when they come in often, um, I'm exasperating them, and they don't care about this. Like the technical side, you can laugh at me.
No,
Trust me,
I
it's
think it's
okay.
awesome.
And so some of these other guys in the that are hooked up with Kingdom Advisors, that are doing the lifestyle financial planning type things. I've got a little chart here sketched out on the 3 different hats and all that, and getting into the lifestyle uh, financial planner hat, or so I'm trying to start there, but sometimes I think I lose people in that, because I don't I it's like, I think they come in with their problem, and I'm trying to strike a balance between how do I solve their problem for why they showed up today, but also it's kind of like, okay, money's driving divorce, but it's not the money. Okay. And there's this one thing, but man, there's so much more. And so I guess, do you have any insight as to what's going on there? If I don't ever hear from him again, but I was like, man, I feel like I really like got down to like, what they really, really care about. But
You know,
I don't, so I don't know. I'm trying to figure this thing out too, because I want to help people,
yeah.
and I want to help them at a deep level. Um, uh, and so what insight might you have around that?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the patterns that we saw, and again, this isn't everybody. This may actually not even be the majority. I'd have to look up some of the numbers, but it was very common, that often one person of the couple wanted to go to a financial planner and the other didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Because part of the issue is, when you start to deal with money stuff, if you haven't dealt with it, which again, remember, 77% of couples can't talk about money well.
Mm, yeah.
And so if that has been the case in a particular relationship, and you start down that path, it's
Mm-hmm.
it can be dicey. Like, it can really get to a point where, you know what, this is raising up all these things, and let's just not deal with it.
Right. It could
Right.
be the car ride home is why I never hear from him again, because
It
they're
could
like,
be.
you said that one thing,
Absolutely.
and and yeah, it brings up all the stuff, and especially if I don't do a good job of preparing them for what might come up
Mm,
as we go there, or figure out when to shut up and stop asking questions. I guess maybe that's another, there's a term or a phrase I heard this morning from a friend of mine. And he said familiarity breeds um, contempt, or is that the phrase? I
yeah.
don't, if I've
Familiarity
heard it
breeds
before,
contempt.
it did not register, but he explained it. He's like, yeah, sometimes you know too much about people, you know, and
Well, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I've heard, because part of the research we did also, tons of interviews and surveys with financial planners as well. And one of the things that we did hear pretty consistently from financial advisors, financial planners, financial therapists, is that they ended up learning far more about their clients' personal lives than their than the psychologist or the therapist or the
Mm-hmm.
doctor, right? Like, because
Yeah, because you
again,
mentioned the Tim Ferriss show, which I
yeah.
was impressed by because I like that guy, but he's not a Christian. But actually, I had an episode recently where I think the guy was really working on him. So
That's funny.
sorry, I just was like, hey, she listens to Tim Ferriss. That's so cool.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
Jeff is a major podcast guy. So I always get the, oh my gosh, here's a great one. You got to listen. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, I mean, truly, there is there's a need to recognize for the people in your industry, especially, you do have an incredible opportunity sitting in front of you,
Mm-hmm.
because when you work with a couple, you really truly can get into all sorts of really intimate areas of their lives. And one of the things when the first time I spoke at a Kingdom Advisors conference, when the research was like, we were in the middle of the research, we hadn't completed it yet, and so I presented a little bit of the research. I sort of shared some of the things that we were doing, and I had a couple of financial advisors who came up to me afterwards, and they had these glazed looks on their faces, and they're like, I do not want to turn into a marriage counselor. and that's the issue, right? Is that it is really easy for you to say, you know what, I want to keep things technical. And there's something to that, right? There's something important about that as well. And
Yeah.
yet to recognize, if you are in this space, you kind of don't have a choice. You don't have to be a marriage counselor, for sure. You shouldn't be. That may not be your area of giftedness at all.
Sure.
But to recognize you are going to have entree into their marriage, and you are going to have a place to speak into these inner places, because that's what money pulls out.
Yeah. Uh, so Stephanie and I went to Dr. Kurt Thompson's pre session or whatever, and it was so cool. She actually hosted him when he came to the apprentice gathering here in Wichita, and so we got to like have Chick-fil-A with him and stuff. And but anyways, but at the in Nashville, uh, he called me a border stalker. He said
You what?
called me a border stalker. Said there's these other professionals who are trying to figure out what this therapy thing is. You know, they're creeping in our territory here.
That's
But
funny.
but it's really validating to hear you say that, because I'm like, sometimes I'm conflicted. I'm like, do I know too much about these people? But
Nah.
at the same time, these money conversations, I think when they're being done well, exactly, more's coming out than they're comfortable
Yeah.
throwing out in a therapy session. Because I don't know, I can't remember who I was listening to now, but it was this like circular, maybe it was you, it was probably you, this circular thing. Well, no, because it was really about therapy. uh just wasn't the Love and Money book. I can't remember. Bottom
It
line
was
is people
probably
like
your wife,
play
right?
these
If it
games.
was
It
that type.
probably was. It was probably Stephanie Proctor. Look her up. Use it for therapy. Tell her I sent you. No, don't do that, because then she won't see you. But okay. Back serious though. That's really good, because I do struggle. It's like, okay, is there a point where that saying was true? And then the other thing is, maybe it's more about it, partially about advisors even training people as they start to have these conversations, or like they take that first step of faith to go
Absolutely.
try that conversation. That, hey
Yeah.
guys, I'm not a therapist, but there are similar things that are going to come up in this talk because of how money touches more aspects of you than you
Absolutely.
realize.
Well, that honestly is one of the reasons why a bunch of financial planners and, financial advisors in general will use the book, right? Like, they'll
Mm-hmm.
say, you guys take the book. This is not about budgeting. This is not about planning. This is
Mm-hmm.
none of that. But this is the pre stuff that will help that be done better. And so
Yeah.
take the book, use a pen, and each of you either read it individually and highlight and circle the stuff that applies to you, or read it to each other and like make notes about, okay, wow, that is how I feel. I wouldn't have been able to articulate it, but yeah, That's a big deal. And then now you've got a sense of a starting point, right? You've got a sense for, okay, that's why we respond in this, knee jerk way to such and such. And so now your financial advisor has a little, you can kind of give a quick briefing on what did you learn
Mm.
when you read, chapter 4 or whatever. What is it that you recognized about how, what is it that you value? Because that is going to absolutely help the financial advisor do their job as well.
That's a good thought as far as just using it as even a pre homework.
Yeah.
So I figure out more ways to help people to find ways not to come in and talk.
Well, it's kind of almost, it's the equivalent of kind of pre-qualifying them to some
Sure.
degree.
Yeah.
And it does honestly help lower defenses for
Okay.
suddenly, if there is, a case where one of the individuals just isn't as excited about being involved as the other, or maybe they're nervous about all the stuff it'll bring up or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And if that is done respectfully, if you read through, a particular chapter and say, is this how you feel? Is this how you feel? Tell me, give me an example of this or whatever. If you do that, then the person who's the most concerned, the one who's kind of holding themselves back from doing this thing, they will actually feel validated, and their defenses will lower, and they'll feel honored, and will be far more likely to be able to lean in and have this conversation, and lean in and actually be excited about the process. Now, it still may not be that they're as interested in going to every meeting or whatever, right?
Sure.
That may never be them. I mean, it might, but it may never be them. But the key is that both people are invested in doing something about their finances together, and working with someone, for example, on that, rather than one person trying to kind of drag the other person along, because that is just not a good strategy for the long term.
Yeah. So you're saying, okay, so my favorite advising relationship is when I, am communicating. I mean, of course, proper channel for text message or whatever, if that's going to happen. But for whoever's listening, um, but if I say, hey, what's the update? And I get a mixture of financial and personal life,
Yeah.
is the presumption of what I want to know. I'm like, man, like that's my favorite is, okay, that they get it. Like they understand how much I want success in every area of their
That's
life here.
awesome.
And so to get there, maybe we can start with your book, because that really plows the field for good fertile soil to be able to have those level of conversations, because people are freaked out about it and they don't want to, they just know the last time or the last dozen times they tried it,
Yeah.
it did not go well.
Oh, I'll tell you a really embarrassing personal story about this.
This is going to go out there, right?
I do.
Like,
And Jeff and I have actually talked about this on stage now, because we will do marriage events, we'll do marriage conferences, and wherever we're speaking, community group, a church, or whatever. um, often whoever invited us to speak will say, could you do one of the segments on, like money or money and sex? Like, what are, the big issues in marriage? Because we've done the research on this, right? And one of the examples that we tell, which is embarrassing, but I'll say it anyway, is that there were multiple years before we started this research project, when we were still in the space of we just don't talk about it,
mm-hmm.
where Jeff wanted to go to, let's just say, the financial planning class at our church. Sort of here's, how you do a great job around getting your finances in order or whatever. And, year one, he was like, hey, they're offering it at church. Do you want to go? And I'm like, oh gosh, honey, I'm traveling so much. I'm doing so many of these women's events. I'll have to miss like half of these. And so, okay, maybe next year, same thing. Oh, I'm just so busy, honey. This is not feasible. Third year 3, same thing. Year 4, he went on his own because I would not go with him. And here's the reality. I was saying with my mouth, I'm just so busy. And that was true, right? Like that was accurate, but that wasn't the real reason.
Mm-hmm.
The real reason is that our personalities are radically different, and our sort of financial models and the way we handle money are quite different in a lot of ways. And one of the things that is common for Jeff, and he says this, like, I'm not telling tales out of school. He says this whenever we talk about this topic at our marriage conferences. But he would say to me, and like literally would say this out loud, it would be so fun. How about we spend 6 months and we buy thousands of cans of Franks and beans from Costco? And that's like 29 cents a can. And if all we ate for 6 months was Franks and beans from Costco, man, think about how much money we could save. And he had his spreadsheets and, was figuring out. And I'm
Mm.
thinking, not on your life. And so
How,
for me, saying, sure, let's go to the Dave Ramsey class at church. I'm like, that is going to be pouring gasoline on a flame. No way.
mm.
Not a chance. But I wasn't able to articulate that. I was pulling back from that with everything that was in me, but I would never have been able to say really why. I was like, everything in me knew this would be a really bad idea. And it wasn't until we started doing the research for this book that we were able to articulate, oh, that's what the reason was, is because Shaunti thought that this would be gasoline on a flame for Jeff, which he acknowledges it probably would have been. And so that's just an example of how often we need to dig into the under the surface stuff.
Okay, so Shaunti, this is related, comes to mind, little off topic, but two questions people are asking out there
Sure.
that made me think of is how much does a therapist cost, and how much does a divorce attorney cost? So
Seriously.
yeah.
I mean, candidly, one of the reasons that Thrivent reached out to us is that they had done some analysis and they had found that the biggest financial problem, the most devastating financial situation that anybody could ever face is divorce. Like
Mm-hmm.
that by far will ruin and wreck your finances like nothing else will. And
Right.
so that's one of the reasons that they decided to start this whole initiative that ended up being, sponsoring our research project. And
So cool.
so, I mean, it is absolutely accurate that working with a financial planner, working with a therapist, yeah, you can sort of say, but there's this money out of pocket, or there's money in commissions, or, shouldn't I do it myself, or whatever. That can be a mental hurdle for some
Mm-hmm.
people. And yet, recognize what the alternative is often much more concerning. Not just in terms of money, but I mean, for people for whom money does actually start them down a path of resentment, which is one of the
Mm-hmm.
things we found was the most dangerous of
Yep.
those mindset issues. Start them down a path of resentment toward their spouse. Once you've got that sense of resentment around money, that's like a canary in a coal mine. That's like, oof, like look at this really carefully, because you are going down a path that you really, really don't want to go down. And you want a strong and healthy relationship with your spouse. You want a happy marriage. And there are ways to get there. It's just you truly have to learn what some of these factors are running under the surface, so that you can not only honor what you care about, but what your spouse cares about.
And it's not lost on me that you didn't call it how to not die in your finances. You
Right.
thriving in love and money.
Yes.
So yeah, not just how can we, you know, cope around money issues, as you said, or how can we not just coexist without killing each other, and you know, let's just make it through until the casket and we're good, you know.
Yeah.
But like,
No.
no, let's thrive and let's really honor one
Exactly.
another and get the most out of life. Because I think one of the hardest parts is when somebody doesn't actually know what something's like.
Mm,
How can you convince them of how good it is?
yeah. No, that's true. It's a great way of putting it, Mike. I mean, eh, that's one of the most incredible things that I always tell people about marriage in general. I mean, if you have been, for example, holding off on getting married because you think, as soon as we get married, our relationship is going to fall apart. It's like, no, that is
Mhm.
not the case. Statistically, most people love being married. And you have to be able to sort of have that vision. It's the same thing when it comes to your relationship around money, is you can get a vision of just how good this can be and just how much you can be won
Mhm.
if you will use all that internal stuff that's stirred up around money, if you'll use it as an opportunity to build connection. You can use it as an opportunity to build connection and closeness because it starts dealing with the things of the heart, where before it used to just be conflict. So you can
Right.
take what used to just create conflict because you didn't want to deal with it and look into it, dig into it, understand one another. And suddenly that thing that created conflict is now this incredible opportunity for connection.
Yeah. And um, just so recorded with Roy Smith yesterday, and one of the things he brought up was, you know, in as far as relational maturity goes, ones find ones, tens find tens, and everything in between. But maybe a subversive hack is to work on yourself, because you actually call the other person to work on themselves,
Yeah.
and to come and meet you where you're at. And I think I, I apologize if I know we're running a little bit long. You're really busy with your PhD studies and book writing and all this stuff. I really like this question that was offered up. Um, so you're a social researcher. You also follow Jesus. Both of you are uh, very big on that. Uh, why do you think Jesus talked about money so often?
I think it's because of the scripture where Jesus said, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be."
Mm,
Because he knows that that's how we're created, and that money, and the reality is, many, many people have heard their pastor stand up on stage and talk about giving, for example. And, where you put your money, it reveals your heart. And we all know that. And you know that as a financial advisor, right? Like, where we put our money is kind of what we think is important in life.
mm-hmm.
And so but the reality is that we have to kind of grapple with is money reveals the heart. Absolutely. But it also steers the heart. What you choose to do in your marriage, for example, around money, it's going to steer your heart towards your spouse or away, for example. Like, we're supposed to be one in marriage, right? And so you have a choice when you're tempted, like Jeff and I absolutely did for all these years before this project, where it's kind of like, yeah, your paycheck goes into your account and my paycheck goes into my account. And yeah, technically we share each other's accounts, but we kind of don't talk about it. And we're sort of coping around it. That if we have functionally kind of separate finances, is
Yeah.
that steering our heart towards oneness?
Mm,
No, it's steering our heart away. But when we kind of take a deep breath and go, you know what? We have to be able to deal with this. We have to be able to talk about it. We have to be able to value what the other person is valuing and honor what the other person cares about, even if we disagree.
mm-hmm.
And so, you know what? Let's merge our finances and let's force ourselves to talk about it, force ourselves to work on it. that is steering our heart towards oneness. And it really is that money reveals and steers the heart. So I think that's one of the reasons that, like, I can't remember the number right this minute, but I think it was by far the majority of Jesus's parables dealt with money, for example. So there's a reason it's talked about a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, Shaunti, we covered a lot of ground, got into your stories, and I got into my wife's stories as a self-pres 3. That's going to go awesome. So, because I'm sure you know the Enneagram.
Yeah.
Yep. Anyways, and I'm a 1-wing 9, so whatever that says, there you go.
Gotcha. Yep.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to come and
Absolutely.
share, and yeah, we'll link your book. Do you have
Thanks.
like an online store? I guess you probably have a website with all the stuff on there,
We
huh?
don't have a store because, everybody can go to Amazon or
Amazon.
christianbook.com or whatever. But we do have a portal where people can take an assessment
Okay.
if they would find that useful. It's called Thrive in Love and Money, and thriveinloveandmoney.com. And it's basically just a place where you can look at some of the things that we offer, especially, like I said, this assessment is
Mm-hmm.
really helpful because it kind of helps you understand where you're starting, if your spouse takes it, sort of where they're starting, and it gives you something to talk about.
The quick question. So you have those facilitator guidebooks, and I bought one.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really done anything with it yet, but do you have groups that are around the country? Are you facilitating any of that?
Oh,
Or are you?
we don't facilitate that at all. But if any church, I mean, this is really common where book clubs or churches or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
where they will say, you know what, let's get together 3 couples, or let's do this in our small group, or the church does they have their Bible study season and they offer this as one of the courses,
Mm-hmm.
through Right Now Media or wherever. That's actually very, very common.
Okay. So you
Yeah.
don't, so like with Kingdom Advisors, there's chapters all over. So you're not
Yes.
setting that
Um,
up. It's organic.
well, the Kingdom Advisors chapters did, the Thriving in Love and Money did a study on it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say 2 years ago in the middle of COVID. I'm trying to remember. I think it was like 2021, maybe. So they actually did do a book club, around this topic, and we had a bunch of questions, and the advisors kind of got together and worked on it. But so you could find that through Kingdom Advisors, I'm sure, or I would encourage
But that
anybody
wouldn't,
listening. I'm sorry.
is that for general public to go to and join
That
a
was for specifically the Kingdom Advisors,
okay.
planners.
That
But
sounds about right.
for the general public, honestly, we have seen a really, really valuable, model, being a financial advisor often, or somebody who just cares about money and marriage and stewardship and that kind of thing, going to their church and say, we would really like to do a small group around this topic,
Mm-hmm.
some sort of study, and have it be offered as part of the spring, courses or whatever, and have the people who really need that be able to sign up.
Mm-hmm.
That has proven to be really, really valuable.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
So now we got a model that can multiply. We
Yep.
got a lot of great advice, got books, facilitator guide. What else do we need?
I think that's it.
I think we're good to go. Awesome. Well, Shaunti, I really appreciate your research and both you and Jeff just being vulnerable and leading with that and putting it out there so other people can feel good about that, doing it for themselves.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that'll wrap it up. And thank you so much for your time.